Among the countless figures in Scripture, few stir as much mystery and unease as Jephthah. His story is not merely written, it echoes like a shadowed whisper through time, drawing us into questions no heart can easily answer. Tonight, we open the door to a tale wrapped in faith, conflict, and a vow that feels almost unbearable to hear. This is not a gentle story. It is a moment when human desperation reached for the divine, and the cost was greater than anyone could imagine. A vow, a consequence, and a silence that still unsettles the soul. What drove Jephthah to such an edge, and what hidden truth lies beneath this ancient decision? Before we step further, I ask you to type 777 inches, the comments as a mark of reverence. A way of saying, I'm ready to walk into the depths of this mystery. Every 777 shines like a candle on this journey. And to each of you who has shown love through super thanks. Thank you. You make it possible to bring these forgotten stories back into the light. Now, let us turn the ancient page and slowly walk into the world where Jephthah's story was born, a world without kings, a world of chaos, and a vow that would change everything. Jephthah's dark story. Why did he sacrifice his daughter to God? The shocking truth. Jephthah's story begins in the rugged land of Gilead, a territory lying east of the Jordan River, marked by steep hills, rocky valleys, and paths carved out by travelers and warriors alike. This was no ordinary region. It was a place of constant tension, prized for its strategic location and resources. Yet from this land of contested borders came a child whose very birth carried a stigma that would shape the course of his life. The scriptures tell us that Jephthah was the son of Gilead, a man of influence and prominence, and a woman labeled by the Bible as a prostitute. From the moment of his first cry, Jephthah's identity was shadowed by whispers. And in a culture where lineage determined honor, this background branded him as one who did not fully belong. Even though his father's name carried weight, Jephthah never tasted the fullness of that privilege. His half-brothers, born from Gilead's legitimate wife, could not see him as one of their own. To them, he was not a brother but a threat, an unwanted reminder of their father's failings, and a danger to their inheritance. The household air thickened with contempt until rejection became his daily bread. The weight of it was crushing. Every day he was forced to face the cruel reminder that no matter his strength, his wit, or his courage, he would never be enough because of something he could not control. In time, their hostility reached its breaking point. They cast him out, stripping him not only of a home, but of the very right to stand within his father's household. Their words were sharp and final. Jephthah would have no share in the inheritance, for he was the son of another woman, with his family's door shut against him. Jephthah was forced to walk away from the land of his father. He made his way to Tob, a place that lay outside the margins of respectability, inhabited by wanderers, fugitives, and those society had deemed unworthy. Yet it was here, in the wilderness of exile, that the hidden threads of his destiny began to weave together. In Tob, Jephthah drew to himself men described in Scripture as worthless fellows, outlaws, misfits, men without honor. But were they truly worthless, or were they, like Jephthah, men wounded by rejection, carrying scars of betrayal and longing for a place to belong? Under Jephthah's guidance, this unlikely band transformed. His natural strength as a leader emerged, tested in hardship, sharpened by necessity. He molded them into more than wanderers. He forged them into a fighting force. What began as a cluster of discarded souls became a disciplined band of warriors, bound by loyalty to the one man who had given them purpose. His reputation spread throughout the region: Jephthah, the outcast. Jephthah, the unwanted, had become Jephthah, the warrior. The question lingered in the air: could it be that the very rejection meant to destroy him was preparing him for something far greater? Over the years, Jephthah's name began to carry weight far beyond the borders of Tob. Whispers spread of his strength, his courage in the face of danger, and the keen, strategic mind that allowed him to lead men who once had no purpose. The very qualities that had once seemed wasted on an outcast began to forge his reputation as a man not to be underestimated. Ironically, it was those very traits that would one day cause the same people who had driven him away to seek him with urgency. During this time, Israel once again entered into a familiar cycle of sorrow. The nation had stumbled into sin and, as often happened in the days of the judges, the Lord allowed their enemies to rise against them. This time, it was the Ammonites, a fierce, aggressive people who lived east of the Jordan. They rose like a storm, their claim rooted in a grievance that went back generations. They accused Israel of seizing their land when they had come out of Egypt, demanding that it be returned. Scripture recalls their words with chilling clarity: Israel took away my land, now therefore restore those lands peaceably. Judges 11:13. The tribes of Israel, especially those dwelling in Gilead, found themselves cornered. The Ammonites pressed harder, encroaching deeper, tightening their grip on the land until the survival of Israel's families and future seemed uncertain. And worse still, the Israelites could not build any line of defense strong enough to withstand the assault. Every attempt to resist crumbled. Their warriors lacked unity. Their strategies collapsed, and their walls were no match for the ferocity of their enemies. The threat was not just looming, it was breaking through. Crops could be trampled, homes reduced to ashes, and the covenant people swallowed by despair. Who could lead them now? Who could deliver them when even their defenses failed? It was in this moment of desperation that the elders of Gilead did what must have seemed unthinkable only years before they sought out the very man they had once despised. They traveled the rough paths to Tob, humbled and weary, and stood before Jephthah. Imagine the scene: the elders, once proud in their authority, now with dust upon their garments, voice lowered, pleading for the help of the outcast. They begged him to return and stand against the Ammonite threat, for no other could rally Israel as he could. Jephthah listened, but his heart was not quick to trust. Memories of scorn and rejection weighed heavily. He reminded them of how they had cast him away, how they had forced him to wander far from his father's house. And now, in the hour of their greatest need, they turned to him. Would you, in his place, have found it easy to forgive, or would every bitter word echo in your ears as their faces bowed before you? The elders, however, did not flinch from admitting their wrongs. They acknowledged their sin against him and pleaded once more. Swallowing their pride, they offered not only a chance for him to lead them in war, but also the promise of authority in peace. It was more than an invitation to battle. It was an offer to restore his honor and place among his people. Jephthah considered their words carefully. Before him lay a moment that could rewrite his story, a path to rise from the ashes of rejection into a role of leadership and dignity. Yet he was not content with mere words. To bind the covenant between them, He demanded that the elders swear before the Lord himself that they would uphold their promise. Only then did Jephthah agree, setting into motion a chain of events that would test not only his courage but the very depths of his faith. With the oath sealed before the Lord, Jephthah returned to Gilead with new authority. For the first time, he was no longer the outcast lurking at the fringes, but the chosen commander of Israel's desperate forces. The people looked to him with fragile hope, their survival bound to his decisions. Yet before raising the sword, Jephthah did something unexpected. He sought peace. He understood that war would bleed the land and crush the families who had already lived too long under the shadow of fear. So he turned first to diplomacy, proving that his wisdom was as sharp as his courage. Jephthah sent messengers across the river to the king of the Ammonites with a question both simple and piercing: "Why do you attack us?" The reply came back like an accusation carved in stone. The Ammonite king declared that Israel had stolen their land when they came out of Egypt, demanding its return as if centuries of time had never passed. To him, Israel was nothing more than a thief clinging to stolen soil. But Jephthah did not allow this charge to stand unanswered. With the precision of a scribe and the conviction of a prophet, he recounted the history of Israel's wilderness journey. He reminded the Ammonite king that Israel had sought peace with Edom and Moab, asking only for safe passage. Yet both nations had refused. Israel had not raised a hand against them. It was only when they turned toward the land of the Amorites that the conflict erupted. The Amorite king, instead of granting passage, marched out with his armies. But the God of Israel, mighty and faithful, delivered the Amorites into Israel's hand. From that victory, the land was rightfully secured, not by theft, but by conquest through divine deliverance. Jephthah pressed the argument further, saying in essence, "If your God Chemosh gives you land, do you not claim it? Then why should we not keep the land that our God, the Lord himself, has given into our hands?" The case was not merely political, it was theological. The land was not Israel's by human cunning, but by divine decree. And then he added a detail that silenced every question of legitimacy. Israel had lived there for 300 years, generation after generation, without a single move from Ammon to reclaim it. If the land truly belonged to them, why had they remained silent for centuries? Finally, Jephthah lifted the matter beyond human debate. His conclusion was not only the voice of a commander, but of a man of faith. Let the Lord, the judge, decide this day between the Israelites and the Ammonites. Judges 11:27. In that statement, he declared that the battle was not his alone, it was to be weighed in the scales of heaven. Yet even this carefully woven defense, rooted in history and in the sovereignty of God, fell on deaf ears. The Ammonite king refused to listen. His pride and ambition drowned out the truth. Diplomacy had spoken. History had testified. Faith had appealed, but war now became inevitable. And so the stage was set for a confrontation where not only swords would clash, but destinies would be tested beneath the gaze of God. Before the swords clashed and the cries of battle rose into the air, Jephthah made a decision that would forever shadow his legacy. Standing on the threshold of war, he turned not first to his men, nor to his own strength, but to the Lord of Israel. In a moment of desperation mixed with devotion, he spoke a vow that still unsettles readers of Scripture to this very day. He promised that if God would grant him victory over the Ammonites, then whatever came first through the doors of his own house to meet him upon his return would be offered up as a burnt sacrifice to the Lord. This oath carried the weight of sincerity, but also the seeds of tragedy. It was as if Jephthah, the rejected son who had risen to be leader, felt that victory could not come without a binding pledge, an offering so costly that it would prove his loyalty beyond question. Yet how carefully had he considered the words? Did he imagine an ox or a goat would emerge from his household courtyard to greet him? Did he picture the bleating of a sheep or the lowing of cattle, fitting for sacrifice under the law? Some scholars believe that was his expectation, that he thought in terms of animals rather than human life. But Scripture's silence until the moment of fulfillment leaves an ominous pause, a reminder that vows made in haste can open doors to sorrows unimaginable. And yet, God granted him victory. The Ammonites were crushed before the armies of Israel, and the land that had trembled under their oppression was suddenly at peace. Jephthah's strategies, his courage, and his God-given wisdom proved decisive. The invader was routed, and the name of Jephthah was carried throughout the land as the man who delivered Gilead. For a brief moment, triumph sang louder than sorrow. But triumph can be fleeting. As Jephthah returned home, ready to taste the sweetness of victory, the sound that reached his ears was not the cry of animals, but the music of celebration. Out from the doorway of his house came his daughter, his only child, dancing to the beat of timbrels. The very one who should have been his joy became the embodiment of his grief. At that moment, the vow he had spoken crashed down upon him like a weight too heavy to bear. Scripture records his lament with raw anguish. "Alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low. You have become the cause of great trouble for me. For I have made a vow to the Lord, and I cannot break it." Judges 11:35. His clothes were torn, his heart shattered, his victory poisoned by his own words. The sight of his daughter in celebration became the very picture of sorrow. And yet, the daughter, unnamed by the text, but remembered for her courage, answered with grace that stirs hearts even centuries later. She did not resist him, nor curse the vow that had ensnared her life. Instead, she accepted her fate with a strength that seems almost beyond comprehension. She asked for only one request, that she might be allowed 2 months to wander the hills with her companions and mourn her virginity, for she would never know the joy of marriage or children. Jephthah granted her this final wish. For 2 months she dwelled in the mountains. Her laughter with friends turned into weeping songs. Her dreams for the future buried beneath the shadow of her father's vow. And then the time came. Scripture tells us simply that Jephthah did with her according to the vow he had made. Yet here, the text leaves us standing in the tension of uncertainty. Did he truly offer her as a burnt offering, laying her life upon the altar, or was she consecrated, set apart to the Lord, living the rest of her days in perpetual service, never to marry, never to bear children, for centuries? Scholars and believers alike have wrestled with this haunting ambiguity. Some insist that the vow was fulfilled literally, that Jephthah's daughter became a human sacrifice. Others argue that she was symbolically sacrificed, devoted to a life of holy service without family or legacy. The Bible itself does not resolve the mystery, leaving the story suspended in its tragic silence. What cannot be denied is that Jephthah's vow altered not only his legacy, but the life of his daughter, whose courage and obedience echo like a lament through the pages of Judges. It is a sobering reminder that words spoken rashly before God carry a weight that can shape destinies in ways we cannot foresee. But the account of Jephthah does not close with the haunting vow concerning his daughter. His days as judge did not end in silence or sorrow. After the resounding victory over the Ammonites, Jephthah remained in his role as Israel's leader, guiding the people with the authority that had been granted to him. Yet, peace in Israel rarely endured for long, and conflict arose again, not this time from a foreign enemy, but from within the very family of tribes that made up the nation. The tribe of Ephraim, proud and influential, rose in anger against Jephthah. They accused him bitterly of excluding them from the battle against the Ammonites, as if his triumph had been achieved at the expense of their honor. Their words were not only accusatory, they were threatening. They declared they would burn down his house with him inside. What irony that the house from which his daughter had once stepped out in celebration was now the very place his fellow Israelites swore to destroy. Jephthah did not remain silent, with the same boldness that had marked his earlier defenses. He reminded the Ephraimites of the truth. He had called for their aid, but they had not come. When Israel was cornered, when the Ammonite tide threatened to drown the nation, Ephraim had stood back. Was it fair now, after victory had been won, to demand a share in the glory they had refused to help secure? The tension did not dissolve with words. It escalated into war, Israelite against Israelite. The battle was fierce, bitter, and bloody. Jephthah's forces clashed with the men of Ephraim, and many Ephraimites fell by the sword. The land, still echoing with memories of triumph over the Ammonites, now resounded with the cries of brothers turned against each other. What must it have felt like for Jephthah to realize that the greatest threats to Israel were not only from foreign nations, but also from the divisions within their own tribes? This conflict sealed Jephthah's reputation. He was seen as a leader who did not bend, a man unafraid to defend his honor and the authority entrusted to him. To some, he was a deliverer whose faith in God had saved Israel from its enemies. To others, he was a figure overshadowed by rash words and by the civil strife that followed his reign. His legacy, like his life, is marked by both triumph and tragedy, by faith and by folly. The book of Judges leaves his story suspended between honor and heartbreak. He trusted in God's deliverance and rose from rejection to leadership. Yet the vow that cost his daughter's future and the war that spilled the blood of his own people cast long shadows over his memory. Perhaps that is why the story of Jephthah endures. It refuses to be simple. It confronts us with questions of faith, leadership, pride, and the consequences of our choices. In the end, Jephthah stands as a reminder that even those who rise in faith can be weighed down by human frailty, and that the vows we make, whether in desperation or devotion, echo far beyond the moment they are spoken. Centuries after his death, Jephthah's name did not fade into obscurity. Remarkably, in the New Testament book of Hebrews, he is counted among the great cloud of witnesses, alongside Gideon, Barak, Samson, and David, men whose faith altered the destiny of Israel. That brief mention, tucked into Hebrews 11, the chapter often called the Hall of Faith, reminds us that despite his flaws, despite the shadow of his vow, Jephthah is remembered not as a failure, but as a man who acted in faith when the stakes were unbearably high. His place among the heroes of faith shows us that God does not measure lives by perfection alone, but by the trust placed in him even in the midst of weakness. Yet the story of Jephthah is not one that can be read quickly and put aside. It demands reflection. It presses the reader to wrestle with the nature of faith, obedience, and the weight of our words. His vow was not born from rebellion, but from a desire to honor God with all he had. Still, it was rash, spoken without foresight, and it brought tragedy to his own household. How many times do human beings, driven by desperation or zeal, speak words they cannot take back? Jephthah's life cries out as a warning of the power of promises, especially when those promises are directed toward heaven. The narrative also reveals something deeply human, the instinct to bargain with God when fear presses in. How often do people, in moments of desperation, whisper prayers that sound more like bargains than trust? If you do this, then I will. Jephthah's story shows us the danger of such vows and the cost that may come when human fear intertwines with sacred commitments. Faith, in its truest form, rests in trust rather than negotiation. But beyond the vow lies another lesson, the challenge of leadership in a fractured, unstable society. Jephthah rose from rejection, from the status of an outcast, to become the deliverer of Israel. He bore the weight of guiding a nation riddled with tribal rivalries and mistrust. His own tribe opposed him, his own family had cast him aside, and yet, in the critical moment, he rose to the occasion and led with courage. His life reminds us that leadership often comes not from those who stand in comfort, but from those who have walked through rejection and pain, learning resilience along the way. In the end, Jephthah's legacy is woven with both light and shadow. He is a man remembered for faith, and yet his story is colored by sorrow. He teaches us that God's deliverers are not flawless saints, but broken vessels through whom divine power shines. His name stands among the faithful because, when it mattered most, he trusted God to deliver Israel. His life stands as a reminder that even in weakness, even in complexity, faith is what God honors, and faith is what ultimately endures. Jephthah's story ultimately underscores a truth that echoes throughout Scripture. God can raise up anyone, regardless of their birth, their past, or their circumstances, to accomplish his purposes. A man once cast out of his father's house became the very instrument of Israel's deliverance. His life reminds us that rejection does not cancel calling, and that God's hand is not bound by human labels or limitations. Yet his vow, spoken in the heat of desperation before battle, has ignited centuries of debate. Was it an act of misguided zeal, a tragic error of faith that led to unimaginable loss? Or was it, in its own way, a testament to the seriousness with which Jephthah treated his commitments before God? The ambiguity of the text, particularly regarding the fate of his daughter, only deepens the weight of the story. Was she offered as a literal sacrifice, or consecrated in lifelong service, cut off from marriage and family? The silence of Scripture leaves us lingering in uncertainty, forcing us to confront the discomfort rather than escape it. What cannot be denied is that the story lays bare the tension between devotion and consequence, faith and folly, zeal and wisdom. In Jephthah we see both the heights of faith, trusting God to deliver Israel from her enemies, and the depths of human sorrow, where words spoken rashly brought grief no victory could erase. His life reminds us that passion, though essential, must be tempered with discernment, and that vows made before God carry a weight heavier than stone. The account of Jephthah in Judges stands as a solemn mirror, reflecting not only the courage of a man who rose from rejection to leadership, but also the dangers of unchecked zeal and the ripple effects of our decisions. It urges us to pause before we speak, to measure carefully the promises we make not only to God, but to others, knowing that words once spoken can shape destinies. As we reflect on Jephthah's legacy, we are called to a faith that is both fervent and wise, passionate yet humble, bold yet measured. His story invites every reader to examine their own walk of faith, the commitments they make, the sacrifices they are willing to bear, and the wisdom they bring to the path of devotion. For faith without wisdom can wound, but faith with discernment becomes a force that not only delivers, but also preserves life. Jephthah's name remains written among the heroes of faith because, in all his brokenness, he trusted the Lord. But his story endures as both inspiration and warning, that faith must walk hand in hand with wisdom, humility, and restraint. It is a call across the ages to honor God not only with zeal, but with integrity of word, clarity of thought, and the humility of heart that seeks his will above all else. Jephthah's life stands as a vivid example of how cultural expectations, fractured family dynamics, and the weight of personal decisions converge to shape destiny. His story is not merely one of battlefields and vows, but of a man pressed into leadership under the heaviest of circumstances, where each choice carried consequences not only for his own household, but for the nation of Israel itself. In Jephthah, we see a portrait of resilience carved out of rejection, and of strength born from wounds that never fully healed. The scars of his early years defined the soil from which his character grew, branded as illegitimate, driven from his father's house, and cast aside by brothers who feared his claim. Jephthah lived under the shadow of exclusion. That rejection hardened him, but it also formed the resilience that later allowed him to stand when others faltered. Exile became his crucible. In Tob, among the outcasts and wanderers, he was forced to endure the harsh realities of survival on the margins. These years trained him in more than weapons. They taught him the art of endurance, the loyalty of brotherhood, and the ability to lead those who had nothing to lose. In this wilderness, God was shaping a deliverer out of a man society had discarded. The band of misfits who gathered around him in Tob became the foundation of his leadership. In their eyes, he was not the son of shame, but the commander who gave them purpose. He understood them because he was one of them, scarred by rejection, hardened by necessity. Loyalty was forged in shared pain, and under Jephthah's hand, this ragtag company became a disciplined force. When he later returned to Gilead, not as the outcast, but as the leader, it testified that a man's beginnings do not dictate his end. His very life proclaimed a truth often hidden beneath the surface of Scripture, that God can draw strength from brokenness and raise leaders from the ashes of rejection. Yet woven into his triumph lies the vow that casts a shadow across his legacy. Before battle, Jephthah uttered words that would alter everything, perhaps spoken in desperation, perhaps in zealous devotion. His vow revealed both the depth of his faith and the peril of hasty speech. This is a recurring theme in the Bible, the reminder that words carry power, that promises made before God are not to be taken lightly. Proverbs later declares, "Death and life are in the power of the tongue," Proverbs 18:21. And Jephthah's life embodies that truth with haunting clarity. His vow reflected more than personal devotion. It revealed the cultural and theological weight of oaths in the ancient Near East. In that world, vows were not casual words, but binding promises that could not be broken, sealed in the presence of the divine. To make such a vow was to take on enormous risk, pledging one's future under the watchful eye of heaven. The stakes were always high, for it was believed that the gods, or in Israel's case, the Lord himself would hold the vow-maker accountable without mercy. Jephthah's mindset, then, becomes clearer when placed in this context. He was not simply bargaining in fear, he was acting out of a worldview where desperate circumstances demanded desperate devotion. For him, victory against the Ammonites required not only courage in battle, but also a pledge that would demonstrate ultimate trust and total surrender. To withhold such a vow might seem like a failure of faith. To offer it was a bold declaration that the fate of Israel and his own destiny lay entirely in God's hands. Yet therein lies the tension. His devotion was real, but his words were dangerous. Was it zeal misunderstood? Was it faith distorted by desperation? The vow reveals a man caught between trust in God's deliverance and the belief that only through personal sacrifice could he secure divine favor. This conflict between genuine faith and human fear stands at the heart of Jephthah's story. Through him, we are reminded that resilience may raise us up, but wisdom must guide us once we stand. Faith without discernment can wound deeply, and vows spoken in haste can echo far beyond the moment, shaping not only our destiny, but the lives of those closest to us. In uttering his vow, Jephthah placed himself within a long and weighty tradition, one that equated sacrifice with divine favor and military triumph. In the ancient Near Eastern world, vows were not casual words, but sacred declarations, intended to display the seriousness of the vow-maker and the value they were willing to surrender in exchange for divine intervention. By binding himself in this way, Jephthah was signaling not only his faith but also his desperation, stepping into a pattern where costly sacrifice was viewed as proof of devotion and a plea for victory. But the tragic irony of Jephthah's oath came to life in a moment that could scarcely have been imagined. The one who came forth from his house to greet him was not an animal fit for the altar, but his only child, with timbrels in her hands and joy in her steps. She celebrated her father's triumph, unaware of the shadow that now fell across her life. That single moment layered sorrow upon the story in a way no battlefield ever could. It revealed the deepest cost of leadership when personal victory for the many demands a crushing sacrifice from the one. The text offers us little about this daughter, apart from her role in the vow's fulfillment. But her response speaks volumes about the values and expectations of her world. She asked not for escape, but for time to go into the hills and mourn her virginity. In ancient Israel, virginity carried immense weight, bound up with family honor, inheritance, and the continuation of lineage. To die childless was to see one's line end, and in a culture where memory and posterity were sacred, this was no small grief. Her request, then, was not selfish but deeply human, a final lament over the future she would never know. Her acceptance of her fate without rebellion reflects a cultural posture of obedience and duty that was esteemed in her time. She submitted not only to her father's vow, but to the unseen hand of providence, embodying a kind of quiet heroism that still echoes through the story. Jephthah, for his part, remained bound to his oath. His faith did not collapse, though the price tore at the very fabric of his soul. To keep the vow was to lose the joy of his household, his only heir, and his hope for a future lineage. This act, therefore, remains one of Scripture's most complex mixtures of faith and tragedy. In Jephthah, we see a man clinging to his commitment to God, even as it shattered his personal happiness. In his daughter, we see a willingness to bear the cost of another's vow, a sacrifice of obedience in the face of sorrow. And hovering over it all is the ambiguity that refuses to let the story settle into neat conclusions. Was she literally sacrificed upon an altar, or consecrated to lifelong service in perpetual virginity? The Bible does not tell us plainly, and so the story lingers in tension. But whatever the outcome, it compels us to reflect on the sobering reality of what human beings may be called to endure in order to fulfill a promise to the Lord. Beyond the personal tragedy that defined his household, Jephthah's leadership unfolded against the broader canvas of Israel's tribal conflicts. His story did not end with the vow or the victory. It continued into the turbulent realm of intertribal rivalry, where the unity of God's people was tested again and again. His dispute with the tribe of Ephraim illustrates this reality with striking clarity. The Ephraimites, proud of their place among Israel, accused Jephthah of excluding them from the campaign against the Ammonites. Their grievance was sharp, and their threat sharper still. They warned that they would burn down his house upon him. Such words reveal how fragile the bonds of Israelite unity truly were, exposing the fissures of pride and jealousy that ran between the tribes. This conflict was not an isolated event. It mirrored a larger pattern woven throughout the book of Judges, where alliances often dissolved into rivalries and tribal disputes erupted with violent force. Israel, though called to be one nation under God, was still a collection of diverse tribes, each guarding its identity, its borders, and its honor. The Ephraimite challenge to Jephthah highlights how easily division could flare within a people meant to walk together under covenant. The unity required to stand against external threats was continually undermined by internal strife. Jephthah's response to Ephraim was as unyielding as his nature had always been. He reminded them that he had called for their aid when the Ammonite threat loomed, but they had refused to come. Now, in the aftermath of victory, they sought to claim honor without bearing the cost of battle. His words cut like a blade, but words soon gave way to war. A bloody confrontation erupted, and Jephthah's forces clashed with the Ephraimites in fratricidal violence. The deliverer of Israel became the instrument of civil war. His authority defended not only with speeches, but with swords. It was in this conflict that one of the most chilling details of the book of Judges is recorded, the Shibboleth test. At the fords of the Jordan, fugitives from Ephraim were identified by their inability to pronounce the word Shibboleth correctly, exposing their dialect. Those who failed the test were executed on the spot. This single word, a simple slip of the tongue, became the line between life and death. The incident underscores the brutal and often arbitrary nature of ancient warfare, where regional accents could decide a man's fate, and where language itself became a weapon of division. It reminds us of how fragile human identity can be, and how quickly pride and rivalry can turn to bloodshed. Through these events, Jephthah's character is revealed in its complexity. He was a man of triumph, a warrior who delivered Israel from external enemies. Yet he was also a man whose harsh decisions deepened sorrow, both in his own house and in the nation he led. He emerges as both hero and cautionary figure, a leader who defended Israel with courage, but whose story is shadowed by the costs of his own vows and the burdens of his unbending will. And yet, the scriptures do not erase his name. In the New Testament, Jephthah is remembered in the book of Hebrews among the great heroes of faith, standing in the same line as Gideon, Barak, Samson, and David. His inclusion testifies to a profound truth, that God, in his sovereignty, uses even flawed and wounded individuals to accomplish his purposes. Jephthah's legacy remains a paradox. He embodies both the virtues of faith and the pitfalls of leadership. He is remembered not only for the deliverance he brought, but also for the heavy shadows that followed his choices. His life calls us to grapple with the tension between human strength and human weakness, between the victories of faith and the consequences of haste. Jephthah is a man who reminds us that even deliverers carry frailty, and that God's purposes often unfold through vessels who are at once courageous and broken. Jephthah's story lingers long after the final verse, not because of its clarity, but because of its haunting complexity. It prompts deep reflection on the nature of vows, the weight of promises, and the high cost of remaining loyal to one's beliefs, especially when those beliefs lead to paths no one would willingly choose. In his rise to leadership and his personal loss, we are forced to reckon with how cultural norms, sacred commitments, and personal decisions can collide in ways that define a man's legacy for generations. He was a leader forged in rejection, tempered by battle, and tested by the God he served. His courage and resolve in the face of national crisis were undeniable. He fought not for recognition, but for Israel's deliverance. And yet, the very quality that made him strong, his unwavering commitment, also became the source of his deepest sorrow. His story is as much a tribute to bravery as it is a cautionary tale about the consequences of impetuous promises and how words, once released into the heavens, cannot be unsaid. Jephthah's life resonates with themes that echo across the wider biblical canon. His journey, in many ways, mirrors that of other figures who were called to places of testing where the stakes were unthinkably high. One cannot help but recall Abraham, who was asked to offer up his beloved son Isaac. Abraham stood on the brink of sacrifice, knife in hand, but at the last moment, God intervened. The ram appeared, and Isaac was spared. Jephthah, however, stood alone beneath the weight of his own vow, and the heavens remained silent. This contrast is striking. Both men believed they were called to surrender what was most precious to them. Both men moved in obedience. But while one was halted by divine mercy, the other carried his vow to completion, whether literal or symbolic. The cost was real. The difference in their outcomes speaks to the unpredictable contours of divine testing. It reminds us that faith, while anchored in trust, does not always unfold with predictable resolution. In this tension, Jephthah's narrative raises larger theological questions that defy easy answers. Was his vow in line with God's will, or a reflection of his own flawed understanding of what God required? How much of what we call divine obedience is sometimes shaped by human fear, cultural pressure, or the longing to prove one's worth? Jephthah chose freely to make his vow. He was not commanded to do so. And yet, once made, the vow set into motion a series of events that could not be undone. His story forces us to grapple with the intersection of divine sovereignty and human agency, the mystery of how freely made choices still unfold under the gaze of a sovereign God. It invites us to examine the promises we make, the impulses that drive us, and the hidden costs of zeal when it outruns wisdom. And in the end, it reminds us that biblical figures are not flawless icons, but human beings caught in the sacred tension between faith and frailty. Jephthah's life cannot be neatly labeled as either a success or a failure. It is both. He delivered a nation and lost a daughter. He rose from exile to lead with honor, yet left a legacy etched in sorrow. This tension between human decisions and their outcomes is not unique to Jephthah. It is a recurring theme that threads its way through the entire biblical narrative. Again and again, Scripture portrays the mystery of how human choices, spoken in moments of passion or fear, collide with the will of God and ripple outward with consequences far greater than the one who made them could foresee. In Jephthah's story, that tension takes center stage, revealing both the fragility of human wisdom and the gravity of words offered to heaven. His interactions with the Ammonites and his bitter conflict with the Ephraimites reveal the double-edged reality of leadership in Israel, the constant battle against enemies beyond their borders, and the equally destructive strife within their own tribes. To lead in such a climate meant not only wielding the sword against foreign threats, but also navigating the pride, jealousy, and rivalry of kin who were meant to stand united. Jephthah's life becomes a mirror of the nation itself, delivered from danger by God's power, yet fractured by division from within. And yet, despite these storms, Jephthah's leadership brought a fragile measure of stability in a time when Israel often faltered into chaos. His strength and resolve held back the tide of oppression and gave the people a moment of peace. That reality underscores the profound impact one individual can have on the destiny of an entire nation. From outcast to commander, from exile to judge, Jephthah altered the course of Israel's story, not by perfection, but by the force of his courage and the depth of his faith. But his life also testifies to the hidden costs of leadership. The sacrifices of rulers are not always written on battlefields. Sometimes they are carved into their own households, their own hearts. Jephthah bore that burden. A deliverer remembered not only for what he gave to Israel, but also for what leadership demanded of him in return. His story, therefore, is both inspiration and warning, a reminder that the mantle of authority carries with it triumphs that bless many, but also sorrows that few will ever fully understand. Jephthah's life was a tapestry woven with threads of triumph and tragedy, faith and sorrow. His days were marked by moments of bold trust in God and by wounds that cut deeper than any sword, a reminder of how complex the human journey truly is. His story is not simple, nor is it clean. It is messy, rough, and profoundly real. And perhaps that is why it endures. Because in Jephthah, we see not only the victories of faith, but also the cost of choices, the weight of words, and the fragile line between zeal and wisdom. Through his narrative, Scripture holds up a mirror for us. It shows the power of faith to carry a man from rejection to leadership, from the margins to the center of God's plan. But it also shows the sobering reality that our decisions, especially those made in haste or desperation, can ripple outward, shaping lives long after the words are spoken or the actions are taken. His story testifies that faith is not lived in a vacuum. It is lived in the tension of family, society, culture, and the divine. When we reflect on Jephthah's legacy, we see a man remembered not for perfection, but for faith. The New Testament lists him among the heroes of Hebrews 11, reminding us that God does not erase flawed men from his story, but redeems them as vessels of his purposes. Jephthah's name, scarred though it may be, stands beside Gideon, Samson, and David, bearing witness that faith, even imperfect faith, matters in the eyes of God. His life challenges us. It asks us how deep our commitments truly are, and what price we are willing to pay for our beliefs. It calls us to examine the promises we make to God, to others, and to ourselves, and to weigh the lasting consequences of those commitments. In Jephthah's sorrow, we are warned. In his courage, We are inspired in his faith. We are reminded that even broken vessels can shine with the light of divine purpose. And so, his story continues to echo across the centuries, pressing every generation to contemplate the role of faith in their own lives, the vows they make, and the legacy their actions will leave. For long after Jephthah himself was gone, his choices still spoke, testifying to both the cost and the power of faith. The story of Jephthah is not just an ancient record, it is a mirror reflecting the struggles of our own lives today. His journey shows us that even those marked by rejection, even those scarred by painful beginnings, can rise to positions of influence and purpose. At the same time, it warns us of the power of our words and the lasting consequences that come from decisions made in haste. Faith can lift us, but wisdom must guide us. For me, what stands out most in Jephthah's life is the tension between brokenness and faith. He was not a perfect man, but he was still chosen, still used by God. That truth gives hope to every one of us, that our flaws do not disqualify us, and our past does not erase our calling. Yet it also challenges us. How careful are we with the promises we make? How thoughtful are we when we claim to offer something to God, to others, or even to ourselves? In today's world, we may not stand on battlefields like Jephthah, but we fight battles of integrity, of character, of perseverance. Leadership, whether in families, workplaces, or communities, still demands sacrifice. And like Jephthah, each of us must ask, what legacy will my choices leave? So, dear friends, if this story has spoken to you, let it stir something deeper. Let it push you to live your faith with courage, but also with wisdom. Let it remind you that your words have weight, your actions have power, and your faith, no matter how imperfect, can change lives. If this message has touched you, I invite you to like this video, share it with someone who needs encouragement, subscribe to the channel, and tap the notification bell so you never miss new content. And don't forget to comment below, share your thoughts, your reflections, even your own vows or commitments that God has brought you through. Thank you so much for being here, for listening, and for supporting this journey. Whether you've sent a super thanks or simply given your time and attention, know that it means the world. May you walk forward with faith and wisdom, and may your life shine as a testimony of God's power to use even the broken for His glory.